Hello and welcome back to our next episode, episode 96, where we'll be focused on a momentous Goliath of a gaming system, so impactful that it has become ingrained into the modern fabric of our culture. Simply known as a Nintendo, by so many moms, every games console was suddenly encompassed by the umbrella of being a Nintendo that it was synonymous with just about every gaming system for a generation. And this system wasn't even a new console. In fact, it was a reskinned 2-year-old offering that was cleverly packaged to look cutting edge and modern back in 1985. Today I'm going to run through the essentials of the Nintendo Entertainment System, so let's welcome the NES. But before we go any further, I'd like to look back to the last episode's photo quiz question, where I show you a heavily cropped photo of a Nintendo item and ask you guys to try and guess what the product actually is. We call this segment of the show What in the World? And here's what you guys actually guessed. We can see here that 2 people were successful in guessing the last episode's photo quiz question, with YouTuber named HeckETourML, as well as our veteran champion, Paco Papa02, both guessing the answer correctly. This infographic overview does a great job at visually showing how successful all the main Nintendo consoles have been, in respects to their sales to the general public. The handheld systems aside, we see that the Nintendo Entertainment System was the most popular in terms of sales until the phenomenal interactive Wii system was released. The NES has an impressive 62 million units sold status, despite being hot on the heels of the massive gaming crash of 1983. So how was the Nintendo Entertainment System launch perceived? When Nintendo decided that it would not need Atari or any other third-party assistance to launch the Nintendo Entertainment System in the West in 1985, some 2 years after the machine was introduced to Japan as the highly successful, but toy-like Famicom, there really wasn't much optimism. The market in America was still feeling the repercussions of the catastrophic video game crash that had seen revenues drop by an unbelievable 97%. Even within Nintendo itself, Minoru Arakawa, the founder of Nintendo of America, expressed concern that the video game fad had likely passed for good. However, the NES eventually proved that outlook was emphatically not the case, going on by providing the reputational foundations on which much of Nintendo's status still rests on today. So after a soft launch in New York, which we'll return to later in this episode, the boxy Nintendo Entertainment System went on to a rapturous reception, when it launched nationwide in North America in 1986. Accompanied by quality, well thought out and engaging initial lineup of 17 excellent launch games, including what is now the iconic Super Mario Bros., this highly positive reception only goes on to underscore the fact that the gaming collapse of '83 was due mainly to the low quality and high costs of early gaming titles. And how did it do in the end? While the NES ruled in North America, it was outsold by the Sega Master System in Europe. However, it has gone down as an cultural iconic console worldwide. You only have to look at the retro t-shirts, drinks coasters and associated merchandise everywhere, to see it's a machine held in high esteem, even by those too young to have ever played one. Much of what followed for Nintendo as a gaming company, was built upon by the single success of this awesome console. The NES introduced millions of players to the wonderful worlds populated by the likes of Mario, Zelda, Samus and so much more. A game changer for an entire industry in its day, and an enduring classic ever since. The Nintendo Advanced Video System, or AVS, was the prototype for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The AVS was pretty much a reskinned Japanese Famicom, with some added design updates and a sprinkling of new tech, at least on certain models. Shown publicly only once, in 1984 at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. The system, much like the Famicom it was based upon, included a keyboard, handheld joystick, light gun, and a data storage unit. The major difference of the model displayed at the CES show was, quite impressively, that all the accessories were infrared and wireless. The controllers shown at the Consumer Electronics Show were also wireless, and could be stored in the front of the main unit when not in use, similar to how the Famicom had the controller side storage option. However, the actual prototype that was advertised in certain North American publications still used wires as shown, and the game's cartridges were loaded from the top, like the Japanese console, and the size of each game was that of a regular Famicom system. So styling aside, this console was likely little more than a refreshed Famicom. The early models shown even retained the square buttons, carried over from the launch edition Famicom, that were notorious for getting stuck under the faceplate. Acutely aware that a simple makeover reskinned Famicom would not suffice, Nintendo sought solutions. The hottest and most expensive media device was the video cassette recorder, or VCR. These were very expensive, highly desirable and much sought after. The styling at this time was to have the video cassette be inserted from a sprung-loaded pop-up tray that would be pushed down, back into the recorder. Taking massive styling cues from this device, Nintendo set about fashioning their new system to resemble the VCR as closely as possible. So did we really only receive the Famicom, after a 2-year delay? The answer is basically yes. Besides the console case and cartridge size differences, the Famicom had RF coax video output, while the Nintendo Entertainment System had composite video out, together with mono audio, but an RF adapter accessory was available. With the launch of the NES in North America and Europe came the 10-pin NES lockout chip, which effectively region-locked the console and attempted to stop most bootleg carts from even loading properly. This was done by Nintendo to retain control over which titles were released on the platform outside of Japan. You're probably familiar with the Nintendo seal of quality that appeared on virtually all the games at the time. Although one cheeky company applied to the patent office for a copy of the boot-up restrictor, and amazingly, they actually released the secret code, allowing unlicensed games to be produced and sold. We have previously mentioned the fact that the earlier Game & Watch series of handhelds influenced the Famicom, with their gold and dark red livery. Interestingly, it is also likely that the Game & Watch series was referenced again to help steer the color selection and overall design of the Nintendo Entertainment System controller. The Famicom games are quite compact in size, brightly colored and overly toy-like. This is in stark contrast to the much larger, mostly gray Nintendo Entertainment System games. This design choice was needed for basically 2 reasons. And the size of the game's circuit board was not one of them. The internals of a Nintendo Entertainment System game would fit inside the Famicom's games case, so why was it made so large? The first and likely most pressing need was that the loading design of the NES simply required it. Mimicking the VCR tray loading system, required a cassette-sized game to actually allow it to be manhandled into the actual console. A second consideration would be perceived value. The Nintendo Entertainment System carts would appear higher value due to the larger cartridge size and weight. Nintendo had already established that peripherals and accessories were central to their core gaming system sales strategy, so it's no surprise that the NES was no exception, receiving quite a few, with many being highly questionable. However, the sale of additional controllers, coupled to a 2 to 4 controller expansion system, was a fantastic way to increase the playing value, although 4-player games were somewhat limited. And in the spurt of, let's say, wringing every cent and dime out of an idea or console or system, Nintendo launched a heavily pared-down version of both the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System, called the 101. Amazingly, these very similar offerings were launched after Nintendo had already introduced their next-generation consoles, but would offer these at a lower price point, with diminished performance to entice new adoptees into their brand. As we mentioned earlier in this episode, Nintendo released a limited batch of Nintendo Entertainment Systems, in a test market, New York City, October 18, 1985. Their president Hiroshi Yamauchi had established talks with Atari before the gaming collapse of '83, but the talks stalled due to the crash. However, he believed strongly in the quality of the system. So he told his American executives to launch it anyway, in what was seen as the most difficult market in America to succeed, New York City. He reasoned that if they could make it there, they could make it anywhere. Initially, most major retailers wouldn't take the NES. So Nintendo of America head Minoru Arakawa, Yamauchi's son-in-law, took a huge gamble that he didn't share with his father-in-law president. He assured stores that Nintendo would provide them with product and set up all the displays, and to further allay their fears, they only had to pay for the ones that sold, and brazenly added that they could return everything else. For the stores, it was a no-risk proposition, and enough retailers agreed to sell the system. Nintendo knew it had to get away from the term video game. So it took its marketing emphasis off of the traditional games played with a controller, even though this is what comprised the vast majority of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and instead focused on 2 accessories, both of which had been released for the Famicom in Japan. The Zapper light gun, which played the target shooting game Duck Hunt, and ROB, the robot operating buddy, which whirred and spun around, taking commands from the television, helping you play a complex if somewhat unfulfilling game like Gyromite. What it didn't have on launch day was its trump card, Super Mario Bros., although it had just been released in Japan, was not yet ready for America. The 17 initial games that were available were in some cases assembled so hastily that many of them were simply the Japanese circuit board slapped into an American case. Put a copy of Stack Up into a Nintendo Entertainment System, and the first screen just displays the original Japanese title for it, Robot Block. At this point in the story, you're expecting to hear that the Nintendo Entertainment System was a huge surprise hit, flew off the shelves and sent retailers into a frenzy, begging for more. But that's not quite what happened. In fact, Nintendo only sold about 50,000 consoles during that holiday season, only half of what it had actually manufactured. But this was seen as enough to convince Arakawa and the board of Nintendo to soldier on, and it was also enough to convince retailers that Nintendo had a viable product they could actually sell. So in early 1986, Nintendo expanded its test markets. Next it went into Los Angeles, then a little later Chicago, then it moved on to San Francisco. Convinced it had a winning product, Nintendo Entertainment System went national at the end of the year, with their flagship game, Mario, now released to the North American market and leading the charge. And once again, that just about wraps up our review of the Nintendo Entertainment System. I hope it was informative and fun to watch. However, before we go, let's look at this episode's photo quiz question, where I show you a heavily cropped picture and you try to guess what Nintendo item it is. We call the segment of our show, What in the World? If you think you know what it is, feel free to leave a comment below. But with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching and sharing your time with me here today.